Welcome to Homocide, the podcast. Hi, I'm Kevin.
And I'm Brandon.
And Homocide, the podcast is for the girls, gays, and theys who love true crime and hate the culture of sensationalizing murderers.
Today's episode is titled Black Trans Lives Matter.
So my story is about the Rosa Parks of the LGBTQ movement. Brandon, what's yours about?
And mine is on one of the women who inspired Transgender Day of Remembrance.
I love that. And one thing that I do want to say real quick is, hi, Anna.
Hi.
Hello.
I
As
can't
our
believe this is the
producer.
first time your audience is seeing what I actually look like.
I know, everybody. This is our producer, Anna.
Yes.
Hello.
She's not just a voice in the background.
She exists.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not
She's
just
a
a
real
speaker.
And we haven't had you on because of these holidays and us traveling and you traveling, and it's been a hot minute. So having
Yeah.
you back, it actually warms my heart because I adore you and have actually missed you a lot.
Same.
So
I'm so happy to be
you're
back.
I know, and you're
Yeah.
like 5 blocks away from me, which is hilarious. Even
I
though
know.
we're doing
If
it
you
virtually.
hear any sirens that go from one ear to another, it's probably the fact that the siren is going down the street.
100%. New York City is interesting, and you can hear
Oh,
these
there's
sirens.
a siren.
There you go. There you
Yeah,
go.
there we go. Yeah.
There you go.
We can hear them for blocks and blocks
Yeah.
because they just echo across all buildings, and it's just
Yeah.
you know,
And it
kind of
echoes
get
inside
used
your
to it.
apartment.
We're just
know.
hearing
But
the
for someone
same
moved away
ambulance
from-
for 5 minutes.
They are, and
Now,
it's
if you
just
hear
literally-
hear
There
it
it
coming
is.
from my side, then there's something wrong because
Yeah.
why is there
It's
an
true.
ambulance or a siren?
yeah, Brandon,
by-
where are
right
you
next
right
to me?
now?
I'm still in Tampa.
Yeah, in your office, right?
I am in my office.
Such a
You
cute
can
little.
see my lovely
office.
background of
I know, it's
tchotchkes.
cute.
It's beautiful.
Look at the little frame on top. It says fragile. Did you get that from a goddamn box?
I did. I really liked the way it was printed. Is that dumb?
No, it's
Look, the
kind
font
of
is really
actually
cool.
adorable. It's
That
really-
is so graphic design
This
of
is-
you.
It is.
I know.
This is.
I thought the font was really cool. Sorry.
It is. It
It's
is
really
very
fun.
nice font.
I love that you put it in a
I'm going to
frame.
frame it. Thank you, Uline, for
That's
printing
adorable.
that.
And you have our save the date from our wedding up there.
I do.
Aw.
I guess I haven't
So
really
for
come
all of
in and
those who are
explored.
listening to the podcast and can't see any of it, go check
Oh,
out our
true.
YouTube video.
Yeah. Anyway, all right. A couple of episode notes, and I think that we should just dive right in today. It's going to be a little bit of
Yeah.
a serious-ish episode today because we're really going to pay homage.
Homage.
Let's call it
Homage.
homage moving forward to some pretty iconic trans activists in the LGBTQ movement and just history overall, which I'm really kind of excited to do about today because I learned quite a bit, even
did
as a
too.
gay person.
Well, speaking of
so-
learning a bit, I did write down some interesting facts that I looked up when I was doing my story that I thought were kind of interesting, if you don't mind me jumping in and sharing.
Yeah, just 2 quick notes before you do that. And that is if you have a
Sorry, I'm
Homotown murder,
excited for
please write in to us at murder@homocidepodcast.com. We typically will do those on Thursdays. We'd love to hear from you. You can join us on the podcast and tell us. My friend Maddie from Colorado joined last time. And then for the podcast, if you love us, please subscribe on YouTube. Follow us on Apple and Spotify specifically, or whatever platform you're on. And then please remember to rate and review us as well. Only 5 stars. Thank you so much, Brandon.
I mean,
Let's
of
dive
course.
into these stats.
Excuse me. Okay, cool. So, I have. Do you know that less than half of all murders with transgender victims are solved?
Less than
As the
half.
first stat. Yeah.
That's
So-
awful.
Right. So every year on Transgender Day of Remembrance, which is observed every November 20th, a new trans murder monitoring report comes out, and I took down some of these statistics. So this is on the global scale. So last year alone in 2023, there were 321 trans and gender diverse murders globally, with 327 of them the year prior. So in 2022.
Jesus.
94% of those were trans women or trans feminine humans, and most of them were Black. The Caribbean and Latin America hold the most murders at 236, and then 48% were sex workers.
Man.
Yeah.
What's interesting too about those specific areas is that they are very typically anti-gay
Mm-hmm.
and very anti-trans. Unfortunately, but I do want to mention that I do think that a lot of this GOP rhetoric about the LGBTQ community and trans people specifically, I do think contributes to the heightened
Oh,
hate.
absolutely.
Yeah. So stop that shit, fuckers.
Stop that shit, fuckers. You heard it here.
You
Period. Done. That's it. Just
we'll make that into a shirt. Those are interesting numbers and are heartbreaking, and I fucking hate it. So
yeah, no, it's ridiculous.
Yeah. And in fact, just I don't know, stop killing people in general, but let's definitely stop killing our trans family members. Thank you. So, okay. I think I go first this week, right?
You do.
All right.
I started last week. It's yours.
I titled my episode as per usual, and it is titled She Was, She Is a Legend. So it was July 6th of 1992, just days after the Gay Pride Parade in New York City, when a fully clothed body was spotted floating in the Hudson River near the Chelsea Piers. The body was pulled from the water and quickly identified as a missing 46-year-old who would later be described by the Human Rights Campaign as the Rosa Parks of the LGBTQ movement. So this is actually the story of Marsha P. Johnson, who by July 6th of 1992 had been missing for 2 days. So what's interesting is that I went to a lot of places to read about this.
Yeah, and there's a lot with her, with Martha.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, and in fact, there is a documentary that's on Netflix that if you are a listener, you should watch. It's I think really well done, and I pulled a lot of information in general from that, as well as the advocate.com, womenshistory.org, and history.com, and New York History. But the documentary is called The Death and Life, the Death and Life of Marsha P. Johnson, which is done in 2017 and directed by David Franz. So a little bit of history in general about Marsha, because she was an incredible human. I really wish I would have known her, but also just kind of some history of the landscape of what New York City kind of looked like in the 60s up until Marsha's death in 1992, I believe, is when she died. So anyway, Marsha P. Johnson was actually born Malcolm Michaels Jr., and typically I wouldn't do any sort of a dead name, but there's some really interesting type of historical types of thing, which is why I'm including that. So
I'm actually really glad that you just said that too, because a lot of my research, my story got dead named a lot, and there was no tying back into anything. It was just to be, just to call them out on their dead name, which is not something you typically do when you're talking about a trans human.
Well, and what's interesting too is that even in that documentary, Marsha's family talked about her and referred to her by her gender that was assigned at birth.
Yeah,
which is unfortunate. But again, you'll see why, which I think is interesting. So anyway, Marsha was born on August 24th of 1945 in Elizabeth, New Jersey. And she was born to the parents of Malcolm Michaels Sr. and Alberta Claiborne. So she was, of course, assigned male at birth and was the fifth of 7 children and grew up in a working class family. So Marsha's dad, Malcolm Sr., was on the General Motors assembly line in Linden, New Jersey. And her mom was actually a housekeeper. So what I found to be really interesting here is that Marsha actually grew up in a very religious Christian family and actually remained a practicing Christian for the rest of her life.
Oh, wow.
Right? Which I was like,
I feel like that's
shit.
not,
I did.
I feel like that's not common for anybody in the queer community.
Agreed. Yeah.
Well, I shouldn't say anyone, but for a majority of the queer community.
Yeah. There's definitely, queer people or LGBTQ people in general that are still very religious. But how I feel about religion in general. But yeah, I did think that was interesting. So Marsha,
I also, sorry to interrupt. Yeah. It's also the context of being born in 1930, what?
1945,
though. Mm-hmm. I feel like because of the segregation that was still happening, church was such a place for community.
Yeah.
In a way that it is still, but like it can't be overstated how much it's like needed
Totally.
for survival, especially for the Black
within
community
the
at that
Black
time.
community. Exactly.
That's true.
Yeah. And so, interestingly enough, Marsha wore dresses starting at the age of 5 and eventually had to stop due to severe bullying, but also because she was sexually assaulted by a 13-year-old boy at that time as well. So because of all of that, she actually stopped and wore normal male, masculine presenting clothing during that time. What's interesting is that Marsha, once she graduated high school, she graduated from Thomas A. Edison High School. She moved to New York City pretty immediately with a bag of clothes and $15 in her hand, and she was 17 years old.
Oh my God, that's so
what's
terrifying.
Interesting, though, is that there's not really she didn't have a horrible upbringing, and it doesn't seem like she, outside of her family, it seems that her family wasn't didn't really reject her, and if they did, I couldn't find too much information about it. I thought I remembered within that documentary there being a little bit of that for sure, and certainly by referring to her with her assigned gender at birth, you could be, I guess,
That's
really
really
that, but
yeah, that's really interesting because we have some parallels with our stories too, and that's one of them where the family didn't care who these people were. They just loved them regardless, and that's
what I'm getting from.
It's interesting where you have their family, but the greater community can't just accept them.
Yeah, when I think that at the time there was, New York City, it was kind of like the Castro in San Francisco, like in the 60s, just during that time. I think that's where people gravitated to because that's where they could be themselves in general. So it's likely, I'm assuming, why she came out to New York City, but also she was in Elizabeth, New Jersey. I feel like if you're around the area of New York City, like you want to go to New York City. Even you did, Bran, and you grew up like an hour and a half outside of New York City. So anyway, once she arrived to New York City, she immediately began referring to herself as Black Marsha, but eventually changed her name to Marsha P. Johnson. What's interesting is that I don't really know where she got Marsha from, but she got Johnson from the restaurant Howard Johnson's, and then she added the P specifically because it stood for "Pay It No Mind," which is what she would often say in general. And I read somewhere that was technically her drag name, but is exactly what was her name.
Yeah.
And so anyway, what's cool is that Marsha described herself. And here's what's interesting and where it ties back to the beginning with me referring to her as her. Marsha described herself as a gay person, transvestite, and a drag queen, and used the she, her pronouns. What's interesting, though, is that it's worth noting that she never referred to herself as transgender, but that was actually likely due to the fact that the term transgender was not commonly used until after her death. So she likely didn't even know that was it. So
well, it's interesting how much that's all changed throughout the years, because even now transvestite is more of a derogatory term that if you're using it in malice.
Yeah, I was gonna ask if you guys know anything about when that changed, because language is so fascinating to think about, and like
by the 80s,
when did the norm it started to become more derogatory?
Yeah, because it was started to use, well, I think the term transvestite started to become a lot more derogatory. I think it was always derogatory, but kind of like the gay community starting to like own the F word, or like faggot, basically. I think that type of also terminology was started to, the trans community maybe absorbed it in general, but no, it was used derogatorily for sure. But I think that the use of transgender started to come about, I think in the 80s, 90s. I think that even ballroom, like the ballroom scene, I think that they referred to themselves as transgender by that time. But Marsha, that was 60s. I mean, of course, she died in 92, so it would have been probably around, but likely she just didn't refer to herself as transgender. So people actually say that it's likely, or not likely, it's more accurate to describe her as a gender nonconforming or non-binary in general. So I'll refer to her as she because that is what she referred to herself as in general, and what kind of documentations refer to her as well, but an important note. So Marsha was joyous and creative and enjoyed performing. And Marsha was a gay liberation fighter and eventually became a muse for Andy Warhol. And in 1975, Warhol photographed her for his Ladies and Gentlemen series. And I actually read that when it came out. It came out in some gallery, I think in the West Village. And she took her friends to all go see it. And she was kicked out of the gallery because they didn't believe it was her. And they were like, "You're just a riffraff or whatever. Get out of here." And it was her.
That's so fucked up.
Oh my
Which
God.
I know, I'm like, assholes. This lighting on you, Anna, is just gorgeous.
Thank you. The sun is really peeking through the clouds right now.
I know, gorgeous.
There she is.
So anyway, much of Marsha's activism was actually focused on stopping street violence and advocating for victim justice. So she was reportedly aware of the risk of this work. And was actually quoted as saying that investigating assaults by dirty cops could get you murdered. And I'll dive into that a little bit more. But she was also a fixture in New York City's drag ball scene, and even told an interviewer in 1992, "I was nobody from Nowheresville until I became a drag queen," which I love. Like, I love that quote so much. And what's interesting too, I don't know if you've seen the show Pose. It was on FX.
Oh, it's so good.
If you're a listener, go watch it. It is beautiful. It is so well done. And I think from my perspective, which, clearly comes as like from a white perspective and privileged perspective, rather, it was just really historically accurate, or it seemed to be.
Yeah.
And
the way they covered the AIDS crisis in the 80s was really well done. Mm-hmm. Especially with the scenes of going to the island off of New York with all of the bodies that were nobody went.
They were just buried in pits. And actually that happened again during COVID.
It did.
Didn't they reopen those pits?
They did, yeah.
Burying bodies from COVID. Yeah. Which was a weird thing to see. Yeah. Yeah. Was it on Governor's Island? Like, where was it?
I don't remember where. I'm sure we could look it up real quick, but it's an island off of Manhattan that they bury people who I'm forgetting the term.
So it was all like when people were dying of AIDS, when they were like unclaimed.
Unclaimed.
A lot of unclaimed bodies, basically, because it was a whole bunch of kids that were kicked out of their homes and forgotten by their families. Fuck all those people, meaning their families. But when they were dying of AIDS, there was no one, and so no one claimed their bodies. So they would like huge mass graves of gay men that were dying of AIDS during the 80s into the 90s and burying them out there. Yeah.
Wow. And then they opened that up during COVID.
To bury kind of, I don't think that they were similarly burying them because they were unclaimed, but I think that they had to do it because you couldn't have funerals or any of that shit.
Yeah, because so much was going on too.
I think. I remember seeing it and being like, I can't watch that.
Yeah.
But anyway, there's actually an incredible scene in that MJ Rodriguez and why am I forgetting his name? Bran, Kinky Boots.
I'm forgetting his name too right now.
Oh my god, he's fucking incredible. Billy Porter.
Yes,
Billy Porter.
I'm like, why can't
I could see him in my head.
All of us.
I know, I can too.
I'm like, Lola. I wanted to call him Lola, but that's not right. Very incredibly talented and clearly an amazing human that I would love to meet someday. But there was a scene with him and MJ Rodriguez. Would love to meet her. Where they're at this berry pit, and it is just, it's incredible. So. Go watch it. If you have not seen Pose on FX, please go and watch that. It is incredible. So anyway, back to Marsha. So she was a fixture in New York City's drag ball scene. Oh, I already said this. Blah, 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 blah. Fast forward. So she was known throughout Greenwich Village as Saint Marsha. And she was known as that because locals admired her ability to truly be herself. And she had a reputation of being just incredibly generous and kind, giving people clothes and food, even though she herself did not have much, which I thought was interesting.
And it's always the people who have the least that give the most.
I know. So now I'm going to jump a little bit because this is where she ends up in New York. But it's worth describing the landscape of New York and then jumping back to Marsha. So New York City during this time was a kind of an interesting place. So when Marsha actually moved there in 1962, the state was very much still persecuting gay people. So they would frequently criminalize their activity and presence, just in general, just for being gay. So in fact, solicitation of same-sex relations was illegal in New York City at that time. So it was illegal to be gay in general. So here's an interesting fact, though, that I wanted to include. And this is fucked up. And Brandon, we've broken the law. So here's an interesting fact. There are 12 states that have statutes criminalizing consensual sodomy, which, by the way, is worth telling you what sodomy is, because most
I was like, I don't know what sodomy is.
Most people have broken this law in these states. But sodomy actually is anal sex and oral sex. So if you're sucking any dicks,
I didn't know
any vaginas.
I guess I didn't realize it was oral
Wait,
sex.
12 states?
12. You can probably guess what those fucking states
I wonder
are.
why those ever became laws. Like, we should look into
That's
that.
also
like,
just
why
like,
did this
how can
become-
you? It's so interesting to think about criminalizing things that happen in private.
Right?
Like, I understand
you.
criminalizing things that happen in public. Like, yeah, sure, if you're having anal sex in public, we've got a problem.
Right?
Like on the side of the
If you're
But-
barebacking
this
on
is
the-
not right.
on the
No,
subway,
but like,
then
what
that
are we
should be
gonna like?
wrong.
Wee woo. There's a cop coming down the street because they like somehow know that you're
That
having
that you're
anal
fucking
sex in your own
somebody's ass.
home.
Yeah.
They're going up to every door in the city.
Well,
And
there
this
was-
is-
Yeah,
So-
yeah, listening for it.
So here's what's interesting, though. Here are the states: Florida,
of course,
Georgia,
doesn't surprise
Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Massachusetts, which
Oh, that one's
actually surprises me. Michigan, Mississippi, North Carolina, Oklahoma, South Carolina, and Texas.
me. All of
those
those,
states.
but Massachusetts don't surprise me.
Correct. Massachusetts, I'm like,
What the fuck?
what?
Massachusetts is where the Salem witch trials were, though. So
Correct.
Yeah.
Oh my God, they were probably
You can't be a
sodomizing
witch.
everybody then too.
And if you were a witch that had anal, it's even worse.
Yeah, you are really going up in flames. So awful. But I did think that was interesting. This report that I pulled was actually from October of 2023 of the current statutes, which none of those have changed.
Yeah.
12 states where
That's
it's illegal to
So-
fuck somebody in the ass.
so-
yeah,
everyone is a criminal. Literally everyone.
100%. Because here's the thing. I mean, this is what a lot of people don't talk about. It is not only gay dudes who are having butt sex. There's so many straight dudes that want to fuck their girls in the booty hole.
Right.
And if
But also
sodomy
women-
also includes oral
Also
sex,
oral
like
sex. That's
everybody
everyone.
is sucking dicks.
Yeah,
Everybody.
100%. Everyone is sucking dicks. Come on.
It's like that should be on the
so
shirt.
funny.
Everybody's like,
Everybody's sucking dicks,
sucking
yeah.
dicks.
We have 2 shirts now.
yeah,
Great. No, but I thought that was really interesting because I'm like, what the fuck in 2023, 24 that we're in now. This is still a thing. So craziness. Apparently I have broken, well, a lot of Florida. All right. Yep. Definitely have broken both. Yeah. So, and probably every other state as well on that list. Oh, well. All right. So
he's a sloot.
Slay.
Can you say?
sloots. Because solicitation of same-sex relations were illegal in New York City, the LGBTQ obviously created their own safe spaces to be able to express themselves and socialize without worry. In those places were gay bars and clubs. So what's interesting is New York City, however, had a plan to get rid of all of the nasty homosexuals by
course they
leveraging
did.
the New York State Liquor Authority to penalize and shut down establishments that served alcohol to known or suspected LGBTQ individuals. So here's what's interesting about that time as well. They would publicly put you into the newspaper.
Yep.
You would get fired. Oftentimes these were people who were actually married and had
With
kids
families.
too, which is awful. But the landscape at that time is that they just ruined your life in general.
I don't get why, even if it was illegal, why they had to go that far. What else that is illegal? Do people go that far to ruin their life? Like,
Well, because at that point you're not a human anymore to them.
yeah, which
know
is
what I mean?
disgusting.
Yeah, so they are actually, here's what this was, the NYPD or New York as a state, their argument. this was their argument for why this needed to happen. They said that the gathering of homosexuals was just disorderly. That was it. They were like, these homosexuals gathering is disorder.
Yeah, and I guarantee you most of those people saying that were probably homos themselves.
Yeah, they were sodomizing each other in their homes. Yeah. So a lot of gay bars at that time, though, were operating without a liquor license, because here's something I did not know. Most of the bars in Greenwich Village were owned and operated by the mafia. And so oftentimes they didn't have liquor licenses in general. So that said, that was just bars in that area. So by 1966, due to activists in the LGBTQ plus community, the regulations were actually overturned, and LGBTQ people were finally able to be served alcohol. But that was limiting, right? So they were able to be served, but to gather, no. So instead, they started focusing on gay behavior in public. So if you were engaging in gay behavior in public, which could include holding hands, kissing, or even dancing with someone of the same sex, they would go after you. It was illegal. And so that was turned illegal. And so the police were often just continuously harassing people in gay bars. And so the harassment on gay bars like elevated and continued after that. So jumping back to Marsha. Not too long after moving to New York City, Marsha actually met an 11-year-old named Sylvia Rivera, who was a Puerto Rican transgender girl. They became instant friends. So Sylvia is even quoted as saying that Marsha was like a mother to her. Marsha taught Sylvia how to do her makeup, how to live on the street, and how to look out for trouble. She also encouraged Sylvia to accept and love both herself and her identity, which is just, that is a mother, right? Mm-hmm. I often, I think about even my limited knowledge about like the ballroom scene and the houses that they created and the mothers of those homes who would take care of these like discarded LGBTQ youth.
Yeah.
That is a mother, right? Yeah. Like that to me is like, oh my God. Yeah. So,
and there's documentaries out there about her as well that are really interesting to watch.
Sylvia. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And there's a little bit more because they're both on video. Sylvia really is too, because they really led some of these protests, but which I'll jump to, or I'll get to shortly. But Marsha absolutely loved wearing colorful outfits, and she would make garments that she would find, or she would make garments from scraps and other clothing that she would find at thrift stores or discarded materials on the streets or shit that people would give her. And she was often wearing, and this is pretty iconic, but she was often wearing a crown of fresh flowers, which any kind of mural that you see of her, and a lot of pictures too, you always see that like, that floral.
Yep.
Yeah. As soon as you said her name, that's how I pictured her.
Yeah. The image in my head was exactly that.
Yeah. Just gorgeous. So Marsha had a hard time, obviously, when she got to New York, hard time finding work. And while she initially found some work as a waitress, she quickly realized that the fastest way to make money was to hustle. And we all know what hustling means, right? That is sex work. So she began working as a sex worker, which was obviously dangerous. So she was often in not great situations. Guns were pulled on her, and she was actually even shot once, which was interesting. So Marsha actually spent most of her life without a permanent home and often slept in hotel rooms, restaurants, and movie theaters. But she did eventually find more work performing in drag shows, but always continued sex work because that is actually what brought in more money. And so with that, Marsha was a regular performer at the Stonewall Inn. And this is where things get, I think, even more interesting, or certainly where her life really changed. But I want to dive into the Stonewall. So if you don't know where the Stonewall is, it is on Christopher Street and here in New York City. And it is like, I get my hair cut right down the street. It is so... My haircut. What did I say?
You said hair.
My hair. Sometimes I'm a little country. Sometimes I'm a little Brooklyn and, I don't know. Anyway, no, the Stonewall is an incredible place. It is so fun during Gay Pride to go and actually sit in front of the Stonewall during the parade, because that is like the most hype, I think, area in general. And there's a purpose of why it is, because it's like the main kind of strip, because that is where Gay Pride really ignited, basically. But so Stonewall, there's some history with Stonewall, which I thought was interesting and I did not know. So the crime syndicate, which was, all these mafia families, saw a lot of profit in catering to New York City's shunned gay clientele. And by the 1960s, the Genovese crime family specifically controlled much of Greenwich Village gay bars. And so, although, like, obviously all of that was not great, I do, and there's some shitty stuff too, but there is something to be said about the crime families seeing some profit in the gay community. And here's the thing in general, the amount of money that gay people contribute to the economy is so outrageously high that people should focus on it a little bit more. But anyway, they obviously kind of got into that. So I would say that there's probably something to be said about their involvement and kind of bolstering our community in a sense. It was all done out of, obviously selfishness and and different things, but there is something to be said about it. So anyway, they controlled much of the bars that were in Greenwich Village. So 1966, they actually purchased the Stonewall Inn. And I didn't know this. The Stonewall was originally a straight bar and restaurant.
Oh,
so
in restaurant.
Yeah. So when they got it, they cheaply renovated it. And when I say cheaply, like, it was not great. And they reopened it as a gay bar the next year. So it was originally registered as a bottle bar. And I've never heard this before, but a bottle bar is basically something in that time where they didn't serve alcohol. You had to bring your own. So it was like a BYOB. So that when they opened up the Stonewall Inn as a gay bar, they didn't have a liquor license because it was BYOB. However, they had liquor there. But there's some shady shit with that in general. And that was because the mafia, there was a lot of corrupt cops in general, which is how the mafia was able to get so big. And they definitely worked with these corrupt cops in general with their bars, and the Stonewall specifically. So the Stonewall quickly became an important Greenwich Village institution as it welcomed, one of the only bars, by the way, that welcomed drag queens, who I put here, who at the time were not very welcome in most gay bars in the area in dancing. And speaking of Pose Again, there is a really good part of that show in an episode where they show MJ Rodriguez's character going into a bar, and it is horrible. First off, because it was mostly white, like at the time, white gay men were really racist, and I would probably say that sometimes still are. And so they would kick him out. They would actually get the cops to come and get like, it was just crazy.
Yeah.
So
well, I mean, that's still coming. I part of my story I have in here where it's talking about when you have a minority group that is not welcoming to the different minorities inside of that same group. And the LGBTQ community is very big on that. And for a very long time, gay men shunned the trans community in general.
Yep.
And so to a degree, even being a white gay man is still kind of the same as being just a white straight man at the same time.
You have a certain level of privilege that are the trans people in our community, non-binary, sometimes people in the community, and certainly people of color do not get. So anyway, with that, the Stonewall was literally one of the only bars that would welcome drag queens and discarded youth and all that kind of stuff. And one of the biggest things that they allowed, which other gay bars did not, which I found to be really crazy, was dancing. At the Stonewall, you could dance. At all these other bars, you were not allowed to, which is so interesting. So anyway, raids were a big thing, and that was where these cops would, and it kind of goes back to when they would photograph you and all that. They would go raid bars and pull out gay people and beat them and arrest them and all this shit. It was horrible. So once those regulations kind of dropped in 1966 about the liquor licenses, that kind of shifted a little bit, but they were still much prevalent. So oftentimes corrupt police officers would tip off mafia-run bars, who would then hide all of their illegal activities, stash the alcohol for the ones that didn't have a liquor license, saving the owners, but not the patrons. And so the owners of the mafia-run bar would be fine, but the patrons would be beaten, arrested, photographed, all that shit, which was
sounds
shitty.
Like capitalism at its finest.
So Stonewall was actually stormed a few days before the historic Stonewall riots, but it was an organized one, so the mafia knew. What's interesting about what happened, and this is where Marsha really ties into this night, but I'm still going to describe the night in general, is that this was the morning of the early morning. So it's like 1 or maybe it was, I think, 1 o'clock in the morning. on June 28th, which if we all know June 28th, that is the day of Pride. June 28th, 1969 is the first time that the police raided the Stonewall Inn and did not let the mafia owners know. So they were not tipped off. So the raid came to a surprise to them as well. So when the police came, they were armed with a warrant and entered the club and immediately started roughing up patrons, which is just fucked up in general to me now. But is that your church bells?
Yes.
Perfect time. No.
Every hour on the hour.
Every hour. So anyway, the police roughed up the patrons and then, of course, found all the bootlegged alcohol. They arrested 13 people, including employees and people, which they stated were violating the state's gender appropriate clothing statute, drag queens. So female officers would take suspected cross-dressing patrons into the bathroom and check their sex. And let's talk about that. Because that same thing that was happening, I'm sorry, when was that? In the 60s? Is exactly what the GOP is trying to push with trans people now.
Yeah.
It's fucked up. And here's the thing. If you want to do that, cool. I'm going to check yours too.
Right.
So straight male police officer want to take a trans woman into a bathroom to check theirs. I'm going to fondle your fucking dick too. All right. So it's fucked up. So that's what they would do.
Yeah.
And it's just humiliating and incredibly horrible. And as a trans person who hates that part of them, oh my God, it makes me so incredibly angry. Anyway, so fed up with the constant police harassment and social discrimination, angry patrons, and I didn't know this either, and the neighborhood residents in the buildings around Stonewall hung outside of the bar, and rather than disperse like they usually would, became increasingly agitated as the events unfolded, and the people that were aggressively manhandled. And at one point, an officer hit a lesbian over the head as he forced her into the police van, and she began shouting at the onlookers to act and inciting the crowd to begin to throw shit. So they started throwing pennies, bottles, cobblestones, and other objects at the police. So within minutes, a full-blown riot involving hundreds of people began. And I'm not going to lie, I would have been there.
Oh, 100%.
I would have fucking started throwing arms and everything, for sure. So the police and a few prisoners and a Village Voice writer barricaded themselves in the bar, which the mob attempted to set on fire after breaching the barricade repeatedly. So the fire department and a riot squad were eventually able to douse the flames and rescue those that were inside the Stonewall and disperse the crowd. But the protests, which involved thousands of people, continued in that area for 5 more days. So it was so big that the Village Voice is who published the account of the riots in general. So Marsha and Stonewall. So what's interesting is that there was a movie that came out, not that, maybe it was a little while ago now.
A few years ago.
Yeah, about the Stonewall riots that was so incredibly whitewashed. It was
so dramatized. Funny. It was so untrue. It was so bad.
Yeah. So I do think that it's worth talking about Marsha because she's often misrepresented on this day, which I did not know either.
Yeah, I was actually waiting for you to say something, and I was going to say, I wonder if he's going to bring this part up.
I am. So, because it's from her own words. So, obviously, that night, Marsha's life changed when she found herself engaging with the resistance at the Stonewall Inn. So, both Marsha and Rivera arrived at Stonewall at 2 a.m., where Marsha was actually quoted as saying, the place was already on fire and there was already a raid happening. So the riots had already started. So they weren't there for the initial part of it. They arrived during. So the reason I'm mentioning that is that there's competing stories about what Marsha did during the raid on Stonewall. She was definitely at the front lines for sure. But there was often this idea that she threw the first brick. And that's actually not accurate. So I did want to put that in here. And these are her own words.
And a lot of people still get that wrong when she's on recording saying that she was not the one who threw the first.
Correct. Yeah. So anyway, I think that night was so incredibly unique because it was the first time that I think that the community as a whole and certainly the neighborhood were over it, and they felt they just had nothing left to lose. Like, fuck this, I'm not doing it anymore. So In the wake of the raid, both Marsha and Sylvia Rivera, led a series of protests, and those are on video, which I think are really, really interesting. So the raid on Stonewall galvanized the gay rights movement, and actually the very next year was the very first Pride, which was in 1970, which I think is incredible. So Marsha and Sylvia eventually established something called the Star House, which was a shelter for homeless LGBTQ plus youth. Marsha was also an active member of the Gay Liberation Front, also known as the GLF Drag Queen Caucus. I'm sorry, she was an active member of the Gay Liberation Front and the GLF Drag Queen Caucus. So Marsha was diagnosed with HIV, which I did not know either. And when she was diagnosed with that, she actually dedicated her time to AIDS activism and joined ACT UP. And if you don't know anything about ACT UP, it is an incredible organization that actually was in a show once. I think it was called The Last Thing You Told Me, where I played a protester at an ACT UP protest, and it was incredibly moving. But during the AIDS epidemic, I think it was Reagan who was president at the time, was ignoring it. And so all of the activism of these groups is what I think changed it all, or certainly got him to pay more attention to it and do something about the AIDS crisis and epidemic at the time. And ACT UP, was a big part of that. But they had like silence equals death, and it's incredible stuff that was happening at the time. Marsha was a part of that. So Marsha was also, this was interesting to me as well. Did you guys know that in 1973 that New York City banned drag queens from Pride?
No.
I didn't know that.
No, I don't think I knew that either.
So as a result, Marsha was actually partly responsible for drag queens becoming a fixture at Pride events, because once they banned that, she was like, fuck y'all. And she marched ahead of it anyway, shouting, "Darling, I want my gay rights now."
She was such a badass.
Like, she was a fucking badass.
She was such a
Straight
badass.
to the point. Darling.
Yes, darling. I love it. So let's talk about the murder. So we're kind of jumping back to that July 6th of 1992, when she was found at the Chelsea Piers. So at the time, the Chelsea Piers were like not great. It was where a lot of people would go for their sex work. They would also go in, a lot of gay men. It was like the place that they were able to go and like have sex and stuff. And so it was not a part of New York City that was taken care of in general. Now, like the New York that we know today was not what New York was in the 80s and 90s at all. And so it's said that she was last seen on July 4th at Hudson River Pier. And so when her body was pulled 2 days later from the river, she actually laid on the sidewalk for 2 hours waiting for the coroner. And so once they got there and did their stuff, they ruled her death a suicide. So her death was ruled a suicide by the New York Police Department, even though it was very widely accepted in the gay and trans community that she was likely murdered. She wasn't suicidal at the time of her death, and this comes from like witness accounts and friends and all this kind of stuff. And suicide, as we know, is like, it's a difficult thing. And there was even note of somebody being like, people who die by suicide, they leave a note, and so there's no way she would have done that. And I'm like, okay, well, that's not always true. My friend who died by suicide did not leave a note, so that's not always accurate. But regardless of that, she was not suicidal at all, right? So with that, there are some things that people think could be. So basically, she died of drowning in general. In the documentary that I talked about that was done in 2017, there's a coroner that comes onto there, which I'll talk about in a minute, which I think is interesting. But it was considered that she may have been on drugs and hallucinated, falling into the river by accident. Remember, the Chelsea Piers were horrible then, so you could just fall through the pier into the water. It was that bad. And there's some video of like people walking onto the pier, and there's just like holes of what, like,
it's so crazy.
It was bad. So anyway, they say that could have happened, or that she even jumped in the river to escape people harassing her, and then drowned. But there were reports from people that said that they actually saw Marsha in a confrontation with people who were known to rob people in the area. And there's this guy named Benny Tony, who's a community member. He's a member of the LGBTQ plus community, said that he saw Johnson arguing with a neighbor with facial scars who was known by the name as Michael, and that Michael was hurling homophobic slurs at her. And Benny added that Michael, who he actually described as having like a really quick temper, pushed Marsha and really seemed like he wanted to attack her. And so he later alleged that he heard this Michael guy bragging in a bar that he killed a drag queen named Marsha. So Benny also told an investigator, I believe in interviews, somebody that ran this specifically in this memorial called the People's Memorial, that the next day that he heard Marsha had been drowned, and that the first thing that came to his mind was that guy Michael. So he went to the police and reported the suspect, but the police department never followed up on that lead.
Yeah, of course, because they wouldn't do anything.
Correct. So there's also been speculation that Martha could have been murdered by the New York Police Department, because at the time of her death, there was a marked rise in violence against LGBTQ plus people in New York that were perpetrated. What the fuck? Perpetrated by police. And what's interesting about the police, the violence from corrupt police officers, is that it was so easy for them to just hide in the shadows, right? When they've done something like that. So that is something that they say could have happened. So now kind of going back to that coroner, who is like a celebrity coroner, and I was trying to find his name and I could not remember it in general. But it's in that 27 documentary on Netflix. But he actually studied the autopsy and all this kind of stuff with friends of Marsha's, who's really been trying to lead this case to be reopened. And he actually said that Marsha went into the water still alive and breathing, and that there's actually no evidence of violent assault, no damage to her brain, and she didn't have a hole in her head. It was actually an injury that came after death, which was her body being in the river and starting to decompose, may have hit like a rock and peeled her skin. And so like that was kind of the thing that may have happened. So, and I noted here again that the Chelsea piers were really dilapidated, so she could have just simply fallen in and drowned. But it's likely that she was probably murdered, just because of the context, the historical context of the environment and her activism and all that kind of stuff. It's likely that that's actually true. So just some important dates. 2002, the NYPD changed Marsha's official cause of death to undetermined instead of suicide, finally citing a lack of evidence that Marsha took her own life. Ultimately, I think that can be ruled out in general, right? Most people don't die by drowning with suicide in general. You know, they can if they like jump off the Golden State Bridge, right? Like that, yes. If they don't die from the impact. But anyway,
you're typically not jumping off of a pier that's close to the water.
No.
Like it just sounds.
That would be like.
Why?
It would just be such a long death. Why would you?
Yeah. And for somebody who was not suicidal at all, and you know, the experience that I have with suicide is quite deep, unfortunately. Not me personally, but my best friend Kaylee, who had passed away by suicide. She was quite suicidal. I mean, we talked about it the morning of that when she told me that she wanted to kill herself, and these attributes to somebody who is suicidal were not. Marsha did not possess those. So, so 2002. So 2012, the New York City Police Department finally agreed to reopen the case. But what's interesting is that it actually still remains unsolved today. So 2016, Victoria Cruz of the Anti-Violence Project also tried to get Marsha's case reopened and succeeded, obviously, in gaining access to previously unreleased documents and witness statements. So she sought out the new interviews with witnesses, friends, and other activists and police who had worked on the case or had been on the force at the time of her death. And that is whose work is in the 2017 documentary, which is interesting, and you got to watch it. So June of 2019, New York City announced its plans to build 2 monuments honoring the late Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera for their lifelong commitment to ending oppression for marginalized communities. And in 2019, the same year, and in 2020, rather, New York State named a waterfront park in Brooklyn after Marsha. So anyway, that is the story of, again, the Rosa Parks of the LGBTQ movement, and somebody who I said she is a legend, and that was Marsha P. Johnson. That's it.
That was a good one.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, good in the sense that it was a, I don't know where I'm going with that. It's not.
I mean,
Yeah,
it's nice and kind. I mean, there's two sides of it. Of like, it's horrible that there's no justice in this story.
Yeah.
But it's also lovely to hear a story that is about the victim. You know, like
yeah,
where it's not about the murderer, what they did, who they were, anything about it.
Yeah.
I agree, and I think that I think it's often the victim is so overlooked. And I was watching a 2020 last night, and they said in there that when murder happens, the pain and the aftermath are on those of the living, because the person who's dead is gone. It's done. And so I think that's often why we sensationalize the murderer and not pay the right tribute to the victim, because there's so much more information in beef and meat to the murderer.
Because people want to know why. Why do they do it?
I agree. Yeah.
What got them to that place and all of that.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it's just based in fear. It's scary. Murderers are fucking scary.
Yeah,
Murderers
it's kind of the idea of, if you understand enough about why that happens, then you can make sure it doesn't happen to you.
Yeah,
you know?
You can avoid it. You can see the signs. You can, whatever it would be. I was on the train this morning to go get my hair cut, and I was on the 1, and the train started to empty the further down I got, right? Because I went to Christopher Street right by Stonewall. To Jack's Barbershop. They're fabulous if you want to go. They are not promoting this, but they're great. Anyway, as I'm going down there, the train kind of empties, and there's probably 6 of us on there. And across the way, this big guy just starts laughing. And immediately I was like, do I need to get off and go to a different train in front or behind or whatever? But I think it just turned out that he thought something was really funny. And he was just really laughing really loud. But it's interesting that I started to evaluate the situation and think, why am I feeling that way?
Yeah.
Is it weird for somebody to just bust out laughing? Yeah, a little bit. And then I'm like, but he has headphones in. He's allowed to laugh. And it was normal.
Yeah.
Like it ended up being normal. But my mind went right to, which I think is interesting. Yeah.
It's like fight or flight.
I know. So, all right. Well, Brandon, what's your story to support our episode here?
So I actually titled this one today for the first time. No, not the first time, but anyways. Mine today is titled, She Was Always Known as Rita.
Oh my God, I love that.
Yeah, so
Rita.
My story is on the story of Rita Hester. Okay. So on the night of November 28th, 1998, one of Rita's best friends, Brenda, sat idle as she waited Rita's arrival at her apartment in the neighborhood of Alston in Boston, Mass. Earlier that morning, while Rita and Brenda were playing racquetball, they planned a watch party for a figure skating competition that was airing that evening. Ending around noon, they said their goodbyes, which was more of a see you later, and they went their separate ways.
I'm sorry, what year was this, Bob? I'm sorry.
1998.
1998, okay.
Yep. So for those who knew Rita, they knew her as this vivacious, full of life woman who that loved to perform, known for her singing and dancing and poetry. She would often be seen performing locally at various different gay bars and straight bars in Boston. From what I've read, Rita seemed like the perfect friend and people loved her. I mean, everything that I saw was so positive. There was not one lick of anything that was like, would make you question her at all.
Rita.
Yeah, so naturally, it would be no surprise that before going to Brenda's house that she would make a quick detour. And so now I've seen a couple different stories about what happened next. So I'm going to say them both, but I'm not 100% on either. Although I saw the same 2 stories on multiple different sources. So for a few sources said that around 4 p.m., it's noted that Rita called another one of her friends, and the person that she contacted was also a trans woman. And from what I see, she was afraid to go on record due to the nature of the murder. So I don't have a name for who this friend is, but she called this friend to meet her at at a local dive bar called the Silhouette Lounge, which was just a few blocks away from her apartment. With the plan of meeting at 7, they both went on with their afternoon separately. So then come 7 p.m., Rita's friend was on her way to the bar, and she's quoted on an article in NBC News saying, "I walk to the Silhouette and I see her street was blocked with cops, and I'm like, what happened? And I have a bad feeling." And that was the first report, right? So this one's quoted in articles, but then this next one was on a report from the Boston police saying that the report stated that Rita went to the Silhouette Lounge sometime before 5 p.m. And she was seen last leaving the bar around 5 p.m. that day. So she either was leaving the bar at 5 p.m. or she was going to the bar at 7 p.m. It's one of those two. They were so different that I didn't know what to go with. And I like jumped back and forth a few times. I'm like, I'm just going to say both because then it's one of those.
Yeah.
So, where I just lost my notes. So Rita may have never made it to the Silhouette Lounge, but she definitely did not get to Brenda's home that evening. For Brenda,
so she either did or didn't make it to this lounge.
Yes, but she for sure never made it to Brenda's
definitely didn't make it to Brenda's home. Okay.
So for Brenda, she didn't really think much of Rita ditching her. Rita was the life of the party, and there was more than one occasion where she may or may not have met a man at the bar and ditched her friends. Brenda
sounds like my friend Dustin.
Oh, for sure.
Right.
For sure. Yeah.
Remember that night that you came to meet me at the Ritz and you were like, and I was like,
one of
with me.
Yeah, it was one of like the first nights Kevin asked me to go to this bar with him. And he's like, yeah, I'm here with my friend. You should come. And I said, okay, I'll come. I get there and it's only Kevin at the bar. I'm like, yeah, okay, where's your friend?
Was here. He was here. But we just saw him not too long ago. No, you know what he did actually? So he would leave me a lot. Actually, he's like, I met somebody, I'm gonna go, and I'm like, you motherfucker, we just got here. But there was one night when I had just moved to New York City, and he lives in Denver now. He's from Atlanta, but I met him through a mutual friend who I went to high school with. Anyway, long story short, he came and moved to New York City for like 6 months while I moved to New York City too back in 2010. And anyway, when we were here, he had this little party, and I think I had met you already, Brandon, right? Because I made out with that other dude accidentally. We weren't dating. Well, we weren't dating. It was fine.
What?
I did. I was drunk. His name was Craig. He was a cutie. But anyway. Craig's. Anyway, we went to go to the Ritz. We were at his house. We took a cab, and apparently I got way too drunk and made out with some random dude in the cab, and then got out of the cab and immediately started to projectile vomit my pad thai from that evening.
Classy.
And they left me on the street. And it took me 2.5 hours to find my way home.
Wait, who left you?
My friend.
Okay, not your friend.
I know. So
this is
rude.
This is Craig, or this is...
No, this is Dustin.
No, he made out with Craig.
Dustin, if you're listening to this, that was shitty.
Yeah, we talked about it the last time that we saw him, and he was like, you throwing up in the corner. It was gross. I'm like, right. Help a friend.
I'm just going to let you out of your mind to like figure out how to
did.
home.
And
that was like
horrible.
when you like had just recently moved to New York.
Remember
and you
that
didn't know your way around?
No, and that snowstorm was so bad that the snow had piled over the cars on the curbs. And so when I finally it was horrible, but I basically found my way eventually to a train, but then had to throw up and got off the train. I don't even know what train I was on. Got up to the top, and I was like, can you just take me to like 142nd and Adam Clayton, because I lived in Harlem at the time. And it was horrible. I basically was able to pay. This was mostly when it was like cash. I think I just cash and whatever. I paid, and I opened the door onto the big mound of car snow and just threw up all over the car snow and was stuck on the like car snow for it was awful. It was fucking horrible. And we laugh about it now, but Dustin, yeah, his little bitch ass, he used to leave me all
Dustin, that is shady as fuck. That is so shady.
He wanted that dick, so he got it.
Well,
fucking dick. Anyway, okay, so
just like Dustin, Rita was very similar, and Brenda was thinking that was what happened that night, so she just tucked in for the night, not really thinking about anything else. Mm-hmm. So what neither of these friends, well, definitely Brenda and this other friend, if she is real or not, What they didn't know is that just a short amount of time later or earlier than 7, one of Rita's neighbors called the police to report a disturbance inside of Rita's apartment. So from here, the story shifts a little bit. So I want to switch over and just talk about Rita for a little bit. So Rita Hester was born November 30th, 1963 in Hartford, Connecticut. She was one of 5 children. From what I read, they were all pretty close. And according to her sister, Diana, Rita was always known as Rita. She would never really had a coming out. She just was who she was, and everyone accepted her for it, which is, I feel like, very uncommon, which is why it's interesting that yours was as well. And it maybe just be a Black community idea that you don't just shun somebody out of your life because you disagree with them. It's a very white thing to do.
Yeah, but I think that there's maybe, I mean, I don't know. There's probably similar stories on all fronts.
Oh yeah, for sure.
You know, depending on, I don't know, whether it's race or not, but that's interesting that 2 of the stories that
the
were
same.
both people of color. And
So one of her family members, Eartha Hester, even said that people rarely talked about Rita being transgender. She was just a woman, a passionate artist, and a world traveler. She was just Rita, they would say. And from what I saw in a few different articles, which I thought was really funny and odd, that they would pair these 2 together. And there really wasn't much information about it, but I just thought it was really funny. That Rita was even known to jet off to Greece frequently for vacation. She also had a cat and a pet boa constrictor. I thought in like numerous articles, it was quoted just like that. She went to Greece. She had a cat and a boa.
I feel like,
and I'm like,
you're not
random.
You don't fuck with somebody that has a boa constrictor.
I agree.
You just don't. Yeah,
I agree.
No, like,
yeah,
but also a cat and a boa constrictor. I feel like that boa constrictor wanted to eat that.
Wanted to eat it, yeah.
Right. Yeah. So eventually living in Hartford was not really for her anymore. It wasn't a welcoming city for a trans woman in the 80s and 90s. But again, there's not many places to this day that are really safe places for trans humans anyways. No. So deciding to move close to friends she would often visit in Boston, Rita decided to pack up and move just over 100 miles north. And although Boston wasn't a better spot to be in, she had built a pretty big community around her there. Eartha told The Advocate that Rita was the type of person who would walk her friends home from the bars and wouldn't let anyone travel alone because she was very protective of people. She also got really involved in the rock scene in Boston, often hanging out at local straight bars, which, again, as a trans human, is something that you have to be very cautious of. And many people who are close to her were really worried for her because she was so boisterous and she put herself in places that could get her in danger. Yeah. So on November 28th, when Rita was supposed to be headed to the bar to meet a friend, something happened. So according to the neighbor's account, now we're back to November 20th, she called to the police about the disturbance in Rita's home around 6:20 p.m. She said to the reporters that it took them a long time to get to the house, although the back door was open. So they were at the front door having a hard time. That's what it sounded like. But the back door was open, so they easily could have gotten into the house to get to Rita sooner than they did. With the neighbor's account, they did not get to Rita for about an hour after they were dispatched. Yeah. So now the police do tell a different story. And so many of the bigger articles that I found, like from bigger news sources, tell the police account, not the neighbor's account. So according to the police, their records report that the police responded to a call at 6:12 at Rita's home, and somebody was dispatched 7 minutes later. However, we don't know for certain. We do know for certain that an hour had passed between the time the police were dispatched and an ambulance took Rita to an emergency room at Beth Israel Hospital. So whatever the real story is, which I'm sure is probably the neighbor's account, the timing was really off.
Well, I think there's a history of cops covering up their misdoings.
Oh, 100%.
Wrongdoings.
100%.
Right? So Yeah.
And the major news outlets are going to go with their factual sources, what they deem as factual sources, which would be the police account.
Correct.
So that's why I wanted to add that in there.
I'm glad that you did. I think that there's something to be said about these types of situations when, because who has something to lose if they haven't done something right? That would be the cops, right? Exactly. So why would a neighbor be not telling an account correctly?
Exactly. So by the time police got there, Rita was not in good shape. When they arrived, they did not see any forced entry, and everything seemed to be in place, and it didn't look like a burglary gone wrong.
Except for her open back door?
Yeah, however, they still neglected the back door somehow, right? And I didn't see a lot of information about that in general, but from what I did see, it seemed as if they didn't really do a very big investigation at all.
Yeah.
However, as the police walked around, they did see a couple little weird things. Like they saw that the phone had been ripped off of the wall, and that there was a half a shoe print, which was not Rita's, in blood pooling around the ground. But there was also blood everywhere. That night, someone entered Rita's home, and most things she let them in. And there was some sort of altercation, again, because there was no broken doors or windows. But again, there wasn't a really big investigation that happened. So we don't know what really happened. So that night, Rita was attacked and stabbed over 20 times inside of her home. Yeah. From what the reports said, the scene was pretty gory, but it looked like she was defending herself, because she was a very tall human. She was over 6 feet tall, and anybody who is going to be attacking you, if you're that tall, she put effort into fighting back, and that's what it seemed like. So when the police got to Rita, she was in cardiac arrest, and they rushed her to the hospital, where she then passed away.
And unfortunately, to be stabbed that many times and to not just be dead,
and so there were some articles that said what actually happened. Did she die of cardiac arrest, or did she wait there so long that she bled out and she just died from bleeding out and had cardiac arrest because of that?
Which, I mean, that's why she had cardiac arrest, I'm sure, because your blood is
and if they got to her quicker, would that have happened? We don't know.
I mean, you could always think that maybe they did get to her quicker, and they were like, oh, she's trans.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Let's take our time. And it's sad because November 28th.
I'm not saying that is what they did, but
it could have 100% been. The sad part is that November 28th was just 2 days before her birthday as well.
I get it.
So from here, the police and news outlets at the time were pretty fucked up, to say the least. In all of the articles I read, this is where the lack of understanding and respect for others' lives, no matter if you agree with them and how they live or not, can cost somebody their life. So the news would constantly misgender and dead name Rita. And for those who are paying attention, Rita was always known as Rita. No one called her anything else. So to me, I don't really understand how it's so easy for them to be so transphobic.
So I think people purposely do it.
Oh, 100%, because they're trying to belittle them and make it seem like it's.
Yeah, but I think people are often like, I don't understand that shit, so I'm going to call you what I think you need to be calling yourself.
Exactly.
Like, I think people just feel this like desire to
be shitty,
correct somebody else because they think that they're right, and it's just like,
So there was news articles and headlines with descriptions, like a few that I'm about to read. So. One headline was "Friends of Murdered Transvestite Recall Pal Mourns Loss," and that was on the Boston Herald by Anne Donlin, I believe is how you say her name.
And if you're still alive, I hope you've worked that out.
Yeah. Yeah, there's more. The Boston Globe and the Boston Herald was quoted in calling Rita a man who sported long braids and preferred women's clothing. And they both labeled Rita as a transvestite, and again, which is a derogatory term to call a transhuman. And then the piece that is, to me, is the worst, and it made me pretty angry reading it, is there's an LGBTQ newspaper in Boston called Bay Windows, which reported Rita as a transgender man who was murdered. They even put her name in quotes as if it was a nickname. In other articles, they also dead named her and called her a man, all which they refused to update when asked by the friends and family. The editor, Jeff Epperly, was quoted in saying, "Rita may have been killed because she was a man who lived as a woman. Therefore, I insisted that her status as what I saw as a man living as a woman was germane to the story." He gave some bullshit that he followed guidelines of newspapers around the country, which recommended that reporters use the person's dead name as their birth pronouns unless they had undergone surgery.
Was this a gay man?
I would assume so because he's running an LGBT magazine in the
and his name
90s.
was Jeff.
Yep.
Yeah. Fuck you, Jeff.
Yeah. So this is what I have, and I have in here, and this is why there's issues in the LGBTQ community.
Yep.
They should have been the front runner of how to speak about our community.
Yep.
They should be breaking the barriers, not following the social norm.
Mm-hmm.
Now Jeff has come out since then and said that his decision for that is indefensible. But to me, it's too late. You can go fuck off, Jeff.
Yeah,
you can go.
I'm glad that you're recognizing that now that everyone else has. But
yeah, you are part of the problem.
Yeah. And also the description, one of them was like a man that sports long braids and whatever. It's just really interesting to think about how journalism and the media has such a power to shape the way that you think about things.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so frustrating because when somebody sees that headline and doesn't see anything, like it's so asinine and like doesn't make any sense to call her a transgender like man, but to not even put transgender in there and to just say a man who sported long braids,
and
then
wearing women's
people
clothing
won't even like read past that if they have
they're going to immediately think, oh, sexual deviant, gross. Yeah, they deserved it. Like that's it just is like
it's shitty.
Well, and that's why I think why even in our current environment, outlets like Fox News are so fucking horrible, because that's exactly what they do. They play to that specific base and to craft some sort of narrative to support their overall conservative views.
Because that just plays into this idea that being transgender it doesn't even exist. So for me to even say the word transgender would be making it real,
Yeah.
Yeah. So from here, the police weren't much better. From the onset, it seemed as if they didn't take the murder of Rita as seriously as they should have. They were consistently misgendering Rita and not doing thorough investigations. But the police also, instead of going to Rita's mother, Kathleen, to tell her about Rita's death, they called her on the phone to tell her. And when they did, they told her that her son had been murdered. Why they decided to do it like this is beyond me, but to me, it shows a lack of compassion for humanity. And I think it's super fucked up.
They had to check something off a list.
Now, Kathleen was a very prideful human. Once hearing of the death, Kathleen and Rita's siblings and Brenda, Rita's friend, went to the house after the and I have in quotes investigation.
So I'm sorry, Kathleen is her mom. Right?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
They went there to clean up. With the brunt of the cleanup done by the siblings, they wanted to protect Kathleen from seeing all of it. However, it's quoted to say that during the cleanup, Kathleen did find a bloody sandal, but I don't even think the police did anything with it at the time.
Of course not.
So Brenda is also quoted in an article on WGBH saying that was such a nightmare. Somebody had gone there earlier and had flipped the mattress on the blood and hidden as much blood as possible, but we didn't hide it all. The mother found a bloody sandal, and I remember her breaking down, which is just awful. She also said, and police said they took everything that they needed to take out of the house. We just don't feel like they really needed to do. I'm sorry. We just don't feel like they felt they really needed to do a thorough investigation. And now one shitty piece on this is that a lot of the reports state that the family didn't have enough funds to get the house properly cleaned. They stated that since police don't clean up crime scenes, and the family had a lot of funeral costs, that they did it themselves. However, and that was in a lot of the stories I read. However, from a comment I saw in a podcast recording from Criminalish, it's another podcast, true crime podcast that did this story. One of Rita's siblings commented on their story and said, as far as cleaning my sister's apartment after the murder, it was my mom's decision, not because of money issues. Money was never a factor. She felt she didn't want anyone to see her daughter's apartment nor clean up our blood. I am my sister's keeper. So to add like extra insult to injury, the media is putting out factless information saying that they didn't have money, which makes it just more shitty.
I'm really glad that she went on and commented though to kind of offer that. Yeah.
Yeah. And they handled it really well. Their messaging in there was really nice to them. So anyways, now on to who killed Rita. So because of the nature of Rita's death, many believed that it must have been someone who was close to her, being that the person stabbed her and they didn't shoot her. Stabbing somebody is a much more intimate action, and you have to be up close to them. A gun, you could be as far as you want and you could still kill them. So according to my research, there was a lot that was not done. There are questions as to if the police really collected all of the evidence and did their due diligence as they should have. But to this day, they have not found the murder weapon, and they have yet to find the actual murderer. However, there are some thoughts of who have killed Rita, and a couple of them are. One, neighbors saw two white men leaving Rita's building after 6 p.m. that night. Who are the men? Did the police find them? Where were they friends or friendly with Rita? We don't know. It was reported that for years, Rita had a white blonde boyfriend named Bobby. After the murder, he was allegedly never seen again. So could it have been Bobby? Who knows? It could have been, it actually could have been a robbery gone wrong since the back door was open.
Yeah.
For a few weeks before she passed, she allegedly punched somebody in the face at a different bar in the area. And some questioned if that was related. And then 5, then obviously it being a hate crime that somebody may have attacked her in shame of his own attraction to trans women.
Which
So-
I do. Yeah.
Which it could 100% be.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
now jumping to November 28th of 2023. So 25 years after Rita was murdered, the Boston police sent out a report stating that they assigned a new detective, Matthew Fogarty, to Rita's case because the case was reopened in 2006.
But how was the investigation handled when they were at the scene? Did they collect?
Well, they didn't. That's the thing.
Yeah,
They did not do their due diligence. So they're working against a department 25 years ago who didn't do their job.
Who didn't give a fuck?
Yeah. So, okay, so they named him, but in this report, unfortunately, they didn't dead name Rita in this 2023 report. They put Rita, parentheses, dead name, her last name, which is just extra proof that they still need to do better because at this point, why the fuck are you dead naming them? Now, especially after the family has had such a hard time with all of that in that they tried to work through all of that.
Well, I guess the only thing that I would ask is, had Rita changed her name legally? Because I wonder if they have to use the legal name of the person because it's illegal.
Yeah, but it's also just a report. It's just a report out to the media saying that they're switching. They're having a new detective. It was something that they didn't need to put her dead name in there. Anyways, they also have come out to say that the Boston Police Unsolved Homicide Unit is actively reviewing the facts and circumstances surrounding the murder. And hopefully this will bring a new life to the case, and we can hopefully get some answers. And I do have in here so that if you're listening and you have any information about what happened to Rita the night of November 28th, 1998, please contact the Boston Police Homicide Unit at 617-343-4470. And I have a few interesting facts in here as well. So like I said, Rita's murder inspired Transgender Day of Remembrance alongside the murders of Chanel Pickett, which was in 1995, and Monique Thomas in 1998, all happened in Massachusetts.
Wow.
After the murder of Chanel Pickett, which was obviously before Rita. It's quoted in a local paper that Rita said, "I'm afraid of what will happen if he gets off lightly talking about the person who murdered Chanel."
Yeah.
Hester told the paper, "It'll just give people a message that it's okay to do this. This is the message we cannot afford to send." And then Rita was murdered 3 years and 8 days later.
Jeez.
Yeah. Rita's sister, is it her sister? Esther, I'm sorry. Eartha Hester was quoted in an article on The Advocate saying she just happened to be a star for Transgender Day of Remembrance for a whole lot of other people. And I'm thinking that's really beautiful. Her death was not in vain. She started something that'll last forever. Rita's name is known worldwide. Rita's murder happened just weeks before Matthew Shepard, the killing of Matthew Shepard. But many criticized the community for not holding murders like Rita's in such a high regard as Matthew. Being that he was a gay man, it's sad, but especially in those times, it was typical for people to turn a blind eye to any minority group, and even within our own minority group, which still happens in media today. And then lastly, Rita's mom never stopped trying to find out who killed her daughter. Kathleen Hester died in 2020 at 81, never finding out who killed her daughter.
Oh, Kathleen.
Yeah. So that's the story of Rita Hessler.
Rita.
Which, again, I'm glad that we both found a story about some two badass Black trans women.
We didn't actually know that we were doing that at all.
Yeah, at first we didn't realize we were doing both unsolved murders.
Yeah. It's interesting too because obviously we lean a little bit more just because we're goofy people in general. Murder's not funny, but we just happen to be as humans. But this one's a little bit more of a serious episode, and I think that it's really important that we say Black trans lives matter, right? And we have to, as humans and as the community, fight for those that we love.
Well, and especially as privileged white gay men, we have to be there for the others who aren't afforded those
duty.
Those
I think that we have a duty to leverage the privilege that we do have to push for true equality, and we just have a lot to do, a lot of work to do, and it's just it's horrible. And these are older, obviously murders, and trans people are being murdered every day, and trans people of color at a much higher rate, and so it's horrible. And fuck all of the people who are pushing these horrible narratives. It's interesting too because I hop onto Twitter sometimes and just to see kind of the landscape of how awful that platform is, and it's horrible now. But when you're scrolling, you see all these news articles of these pastors at the church being arrested for having sex with a 12-year-old. You have all this shit, and it's never our community. It's not, I don't know. So it's interesting, and it actually, even when like Jeffrey Epstein's list came out recently, I don't know if you guys paid attention to that at all. There were no drag queens on that list. There was no LGBTQ people on that list. So,
but we're the ones that they say are the ones that are indoctrinating children and molesting children and doing all of this shit, when realistically it's not.
No. Well, and it's funny too because I'm a gay dude. I wasn't indoctrinated into being gay. In fact, I was more so indoctrinated to not be. So
absolutely,
it's interesting, but a little bit more of a serious episode in general, which I think that they'll fluctuate all the time. But I do think that this was a very important topic for us to cover, and not the first time we will, because it is very important, especially as we enter this goddamn election year, this election cycle, and we got to really push for, a lot. But anyway, that was a good episode. Thanks for sharing that story, Bran. I wish that I could hug all of Rita's family.
Yeah, thank you guys. I feel like it's so important to know these people's names and their stories. So I feel, what's the word? Grateful that I have you guys to lay it all out for me in that way. Because
Yeah. Well, I love that. I love that you're saying that too, because I think oftentimes, I think younger LGBTQ people don't know. I think it's important for people to know the history. I think our community needs to know that history, but I think that everyone needs to know the history.
Yeah, for
because the yeah, the one thing that I think with the younger youth is they don't have to fight for the equalities as hard as
Mm-hmm.
people before them had. So now this idea of that right feels normal.
Right.
But that right, those rights are actually being taken away slowly, right? And so you're always going to have to fight for them. They can go away like that.
Yeah.
And I think that so knowing the history is important.
It's really easy to get complacent, and I hate when people make the argument of like, well, it used to be way worse, so be grateful that we are where we are today. And it's like, you're just saying that to justify to justify trying to shut people up. Like,
yeah, which is
if people were saying that 50 years ago because they were like, well, it used to be worse, then we would be where we were 50 years ago.
Yeah 100%. Well, yeah, great episode. And a couple of notes again. If you have a Homotown murder, please send it to us at murder@homocidepodcast.com. Again, you'll be able to join us on the podcast to tell us your hometown murder. You do the work and you tell us and we react, and it's fun. So send that on our way. And then remember to subscribe on YouTube or follow on wherever you're listening to your podcast, but specifically on Apple and Spotify. And please go rate and review for sure. And if you have anything that you want us to cover, some sort of a murder that's been solved or unsolved back in the day, please send us our way and we'll look at it. So any last closing arguments, friends?
I don't think so.
No.
Thank you.
I love that you're back, Anna. Yay.
I'm so happy to be back.
Me too. And Brandon Linus, I miss you.
I miss you too, Kelly.
I'll get to see you on Friday. Anyway, this episode is out on Tuesday, and next week we'll have something a little juicy and fun, which will be very funny. And I mean, they're kind of funny, which is horrible. But anyway, again, Homocide the podcast for the girls, gays, and theys who love true crime and hate the culture of sensationalizing murder. So on that note, bye everyone.
Bye.
Bye.